Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Pedro Rios. I'm Director of the American Friends Service Committee's U.S.-Mexico Border Program. And this is the panel number 5 of the series Zooming to the Border. This panel is titled Militarized Border Communities, Documenting the Enforcement Landscape. And I'd like to ask Laura of Tribuno del Pueblo, who together with the People's Tribune out of Chicago, convened a group of us last year, and she can say a little bit more about that convening and the idea that we had and how we ended up having a series of panels and what we expect to do with the information.
Okay.
Laura.
Thank you, Pedro. I'm Laura Garcia. I'm the editor of the Tribuno del Pueblo, and there's also Bob Lee. He's the editor of the People's Tribune. We're sister publications, and we're produced out of Chicago. And can you hear me? Yeah, I wasn't sure. So the idea that, well, you know, everyone is aware of the dire situation at the border with the refugee and asylum seekers. And then once they cross the border, the detention of children or the children in cages and the separation of families. So what we did, we wanted to convene our friends, activists, researchers, and independent journalists to come together and see what we could do to alert or expand or lift the voices of the fighters at the front, those that are dealing with that situation around the human rights violations, around the feeding, helping to feed those in refugee camps and so forth. So we convened this meeting, and of course we wanted to do it back in last year. That's when we talked about it, but then the coronavirus happened, and then we couldn't, we had to change gears. And so compañero Leno came up with the idea of zooming to the border and actually going from Texas to California, but instead of visiting them, because we were going to get in a van and go and visit them and do interviews and meet with the leaders there at both sides of the border. So we decided that we should zoom to the border, and that's what we've been doing since in the middle of August. We had our first panel, and then today is our last panel. We're putting together all this information in order to do a report to the United Nations, to the Human Rights Committee in some kind of form, and also to use the recordings of the panels as testimonials, so that we can show and people can see what's really going there at the border from people that are right there. And so we're very happy that we've been very successful. There's a lot of interest by people as to the violation of human rights, how we can correct that. People are aware that you know, that asylum seekers are going through difficult situations, and some even confronting rape and so forth. So we're putting together all this information, and we'll take it to the United Nations. So thank you for joining this panel.
Gracias, Laura. And I want to thank everyone for joining us this late afternoon in the West Coast and early evening in the East Coast. Again, my name is Pedro Rios with the American Friends Service Committee. And I have the honor and the pleasure of being joined by a wonderful group of colleagues and advocates whom I've known for some time now, who shoulder to shoulder, we've been advocating for the protection of human rights of migrants, of asylum seekers, but also of border community members where we live. These, as Laura mentioned, these panel presentations will be available soon, eventually, on the Tribuno del Pueblo website. So that's where they will be linked to, and you can access them at some point in the near future. So when we talk about militarized border communities, our point of reference on a timeline predates Donald Trump's 4-year tenure as president. Going back to at least 1924, when the Border Patrol was founded, the brutal legacy of that agency in particular, but also of its larger parent Bureau of Customs and Border Protection, is one of violence and that promulgates white supremacy as an ideological precept in how it implements government policy. We have hundreds of documented cases of border deaths spanning decades in encounters with border agents, and I'm sure many of the panelists and maybe some of you have had those experiences of confrontations with border agents. There are thousands of migrants that have been left scattered in the borderland deserts and mountains, many who remain unidentified and unaccounted for, border agents who use chemical agents on migrants seeking asylum, even when these chemical agents are outlawed in war scenarios, and as the Trump administration eviscerates the asylum process in the US. And the newer threat of the Border Patrol attempting to expand its theater of operations into municipal authoritative power at the threat of trampling on First Amendment rights as protected by the US Constitution. With nearly 20,000 Border Patrol agents and another 40,000 CBP agents, the enforcement landscape is problematic, dangerous, and promotes impunity from any process of accountability. Added to this landscape, the presence of other enforcement agencies such as ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which expand the threat to mostly working class migrants who barely make ends meet and now under a global pandemic. Today, we will hear testimonies from these wonderful advocates who have years of experience navigating the enforcement landscape and who will share with us the different aspects of what that militarization looks like. So we're not, militarization, it's not a euphemism, but they will share real testimonies. They will share their experience, including through a racial justice analysis on militarization, to Border Patrol checkpoints in communities, to violent narrative formation and CBP exercises at the ports, to ICE roundups, and to how Congress funds all of this with your tax dollars. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and especially the panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present to us the information that they'll present. We'll begin with our first speaker. Our first speaker is Alma Maquitico, and I'll read her bio just so you know a little bit more about Alma. Alma is co-director of the National Network for Immigrant and Refugee Rights and developed programming focused on the US-Mexico border, international migration, and climate change. Alma has developed grassroots networks to monitor human rights violations against migrants and refugees and develop various food and climate justice initiatives on the front lines of the US-Mexico border. Her organizing and human rights work intersect race, gender, migration, and ecology. She serves as the North American focal point of the Latin American Bloc on Migration, a network of immigrant rights organizations in the South-North Migratory Corridor. Alma, it's a pleasure to welcome you. Te paso la batuta. Thank you for starting out this wonderful panel.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you to the team of Tribuno del Pueblo and to all my colleagues for being here and for all the powerful work they do in resisting the militarization and the criminalization of border communities and particularly of brown and black bodies, no? And I think I would like to start by before we go into really naming the violences that we experience today on the US-Mexico border, I think it's very important to understand that there is a history of violence that really precedes this moment. And this is a long history of racial violence that really continues to structure our daily lives as border communities. So I want to start by just kind of doing a little bit of a recap of how the border was created. And not because I'm a historian, but because as community organizers, as we delve more deeply into the violence that is occurring today, and as we start documenting what's happening in our communities, then we start finding out trends and patterns that, like Pedro mentioned, do not start with the Trump administration, do not start with the Republican administrations, but they go way beyond that. So the first thing that I think it's important to recognize is that the US-Mexico border was shaped through violence. And the creation of the US-Mexico border, or the enforcement of the US-Mexico border, was done by white militias who use raw physical violence against indigenous bodies, against Mexican people, to dispossess them from their territories, and also to prevent Black bodies to escaping from slavery towards freedom, and to restrict Asian bodies also to enter into these territories. There's a long period of violence that goes from the 1800s all the way to the early 1900s, in which scholars cite massive killings of Mexican people, indigenous men and women, and children that were conducted by vigilantes. These vigilantes were members of state apparatuses, but were also common people that were just the neighbors of the brown people who live in these original lands. It is estimated that in the early 1900s, like from the 1900s to the 1920s, up to 5,000 people were killed during that time. That is exactly the time in which the US Border Patrol was formed. And this really marked the beginning of an agency that would evolve into the most technologically advanced and hyper-militarized border security forces in human history. The first agents that were recruited to be part of the US Border Patrol were actually members of the Texas Rangers, members and people from military backgrounds, and members of the communities that really caused so much harm and death to the original peoples that inhabit the territories of what we now know as the US-Mexico border. In particular, we're talking about some areas in the South Texas area. So when the Border Patrol was formed, the people who were part of the Border Patrol were coming from security forces and from community forces, vigilante forces that had a long history of brutality and unaccountability. These continue all the way, well, continues until today, but there was another moment in history that I think it's very important because it continues to shape who we are and how we live as border communities. And this was like around the 1929, there was an act that was passed, and this pass was the Undesirable Aliens Act. And the Undesirable Aliens Act criminalized Mexican migration and gave border agents the discretionary power to decide who could enter or not enter the country legally. At that time, these agents turned what had been a daily routine of border crossing to visit families and relatives, it converted that into a ritual of abuse that we continue to endure today as border communities. We, as border communities, especially as brown bodies that cross the border, we're so used to having to come up with a story every time we cross the border because we know we're going to be questioned. And we're always talking to our family members to see what's our story. And it's not like we're lying. It's the fact that our stories have to match if we don't want to go through extra inspections and harassment by border control authorities. So this culture of abuse, impunity, and racial injustice was intended, the creation of the Border Patrol was intended to create this system of racial injustices. So the Border Patrol is doing what was intended to do. And I think it is very important to recognize that, to understand that we are living or we're suffering from a system that's doing what's intended to do. And we see that through many times in history, from the 1950s, the Operation Wetback, where border agents round up Mexican and Mexican-American bodies, then deported them to Mexico. We see it all the way to the 70s and the early 90s, in which journalists and community organizations began documenting these massive patterns of human rights abuses. The abuses that we see and that we continue to see are anything from Border Patrol chases, beatings, murder, torture, rape. And we community organizations have not been able to challenge that system of impunity successfully. Somehow the Border Patrol not only commits these abuses, so this is one of the problems, but the other problem is that we're unable to hold them accountable. That continues to create and to recreate that system of impunity that we have seen throughout history. So I think there's so many ways in which racial injustices get structured on the US-Mexico borderlands. It's through the militarization and enforcement apparatus. It gets, race enforcement continues to be structured to the restrictions of mobility. Border communities endure every day. Many of us border communities have family members with mixed immigration status, which makes some of us more mobile than others. And we see all these injustices and complications getting aggravated, not only through the nexus of militarization and migration, but we now see it with the nexus of militarization, migration, and the COVID pandemic, which has allowed the current administration to kind of double down on all these system of racial injustice, of this racist system of immigration enforcement, to continue restricting the mobility of migrant communities, of border communities, of those who are seeking asylum and refuge, and really continues creating irreparable harm on children, on women, on those who are deemed to be essential workers that continue to live not only continue to live, but live on the US-Mexico borderlands, working under very unjust, discriminatory conditions, without having access to healthcare, having access to safe housing, having access to labor protections. And all those conditions become really aggravated by the many restrictions that we have on the US-Mexico border restrictions to mobility. So the question for me as a human rights organizer and activist, and the question for me as a migrant woman and as someone who has family members who are migrants, is how can we really hold this agency accountable? And most importantly, how can we change the system of racial discrimination that's produced by border enforcement? And really the question for me is can we really reform an entity that was really meant or intended to produce racial exclusion? And as a human rights organizer, and in the spirit of really believing that another world is possible for our communities, I think that we have a responsibility to reimagine border governance from a human rights perspective, that we have to start talking about what the ideal looks like for our community, so that we can start building the processes and the policies and the alliances and the solidarity to walk towards that. I'm just concerned that small reforms, while important, they're very important. small reforms in order to mitigate the amount of pain and suffering that's been caused on migrant communities, on refugee communities. But we need to start shifting, and we need to start holding the US government accountable for procuring human rights for all of us who live along the US-Mexico borderlands. And I think I just want to leave it there.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Alma, for providing such a nice contextual introduction to the question of militarization of border communities, especially through the racial justice lens, which is so needed and applicable to the conversations and dialogue that's taking place at the national level, especially with the looming elections that are seemingly promoting the possibility of increased violence. Thank you. I want to ask Ricardo Favela, our next panelist, to speak. And Ricardo Favela is an organizer with Alianza Comunitaria, a coalition of human rights groups based in San Diego's North County that formed to protect communities from the increased presence of local and federal immigration enforcement. These communities are situated nearly 100 miles from the southern border, yet are contained by 2 permanent Border Patrol checkpoints along major freeways, temporary checkpoints, and constant roving Border Patrol units within these communities. Since 2009, Alianza Comunitaria has built a trusted and rapid community alert network to confirm the presence of law enforcement operations. So Ricardo will be talking to us about what the experience has been like in terms of what militarization looks like in the northern part of San Diego County, as his bio said, 100 miles in some areas from the actual border area. Ricardo, floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm very honored to be able to have a chance to share what our communities are experiencing here in our corner of San Diego here. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'll load that up right now so that we can have a visual of what we got going on here. Pedro gave a good, concise intro as to who Alianza is. So I'll be able to just skip through this. And I would just add that we are human rights observers. We have been trained by the American Friends Service Committee as part of the human rights program. And we've been able to build on that experience and what we've learned from the American Friends Service Committee to continue organizing and respond to our community's needs. And to that end, we uphold human rights and self-determination of poor and oppressed communities. And I think it's also important to mention a little bit more about what we've been able to do as far as connecting on-the-ground organizers in our communities to accessible social media and communications technology that can reach our communities within minutes. It's one way, the question is being posed as to how can we hold these agencies accountable? Well, we're trying to find a way to even outmaneuver them in our communities that we can, best protect our communities and families as much as we can. We've been building this network since 2008. It's been spanning the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations. We saw checkpoints increase immediately after HR 4437 was attempted to be passed. We know as part of the attrition through enforcement strategy that groups like the Center for Immigration Studies have promoted. We know that white nationalists have been in the White House, have been affecting policy long before Trump came on the scene. And we've been confronting this to the best of our ability over these administrations. We've developed an organic and targeted following on nearly 42,000 across our platforms, including text subscribers, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So these are technologies that really are within our hands, within our reach. Pretty much the text message system is what has cost us a little bit of effort to gain access to that, but we've been able to accomplish that. And from developing this on-the-ground capacity, beginning with responding to checkpoints, we've expanded to providing Spanish language communications during natural disasters, largely because of the lack of information that our own local county government couldn't provide or wasn't providing at the time, and coordinated responses to ICE operations with community patrols in cities and smaller communities in the area. And this growth demonstrates the concern that exists in our communities regarding the hostile enforcement climate that we live in. This is a network that continues to grow. And it had the most growth, obviously, through the Obama administration, while the Secure Communities programs were being carried out. So just to give you a sense of what the location looks like, this is, North San Diego County. We are communities contained by checkpoints and various enforcement agencies. We are roughly between 70 miles or roughly 70 miles from the southernmost port of entry. We are surrounded by two permanent checkpoints and temporary Border Patrol checkpoints that pop up on occasion. We've seen a few checkpoints pop up recently, this last week, starting the month of October, and we always see them increase during election season. So as a matter of fact, I'm waiting any minute for someone to alert us to a possible checkpoint that will pop up in a local community here. And we also confront police DUI license checkpoints that at one point were collaborated with immigration officials as part of the strategy to implement attrition through enforcement. So focusing a little bit more on the area, the two large green stars are the permanent checkpoints, along the 5 freeway and along the 15, the two major routes to go north, to continue north out of San Diego County. In between this area is Camp Pendleton. It's a federal military camp, military base here. So technically, no one without who was in the military can pass through this area. But for all intents and purposes, all travel heading north along these major routes are controlled by Border Patrol. And just for reference, again, this is where I'm currently speaking to you from Fallbrook in this area, which is largely an agricultural community. The blue stars that you see here are pretty much where police conduct checkpoints, usually on weekends. What they call DUI license checkpoints, but again, due to immigration policies, when they first enacted these checkpoints, it was at a time when there were agreements with local police and ICE, and it was also a time when our undocumented family members weren't eligible to get a driver's license. So these checkpoints, police checkpoints, effectively became immigration checkpoints. We know that for every one drunk driver that passed through a checkpoint, there were 10 undocumented folks that ended up getting deported. So this is the landscape of what our daily life looks like. And on the weekends, we get these additional police checkpoints that will usually pop up in one community at a time on a weekend. So the U.S. Border Patrol checkpoints have existed in the area for decades. I remember passing through them at a young age along the 76. And just even though I was born in the area, I just remember being told and to speak clearly when you pass a checkpoint. Just there was that constant possibility that this agency could do something harmful to us, that was ingrained from as a youth. And of course, we come to see how that actually takes place in terms of deportations and separation of families. Racial profiling is commonplace. That goes with the policies that we know that Border Patrol works with. Again, 2 permanent checkpoints monitoring traffic, and also consists of temporary checkpoints that pop up in our communities, mostly around these 2 checkpoints, impeding travel from to and from work, school to local clinics and hospitals. And I want to focus in a little bit further on the 15 checkpoint, which is right here, the Revisión de Migra right here. So I speaking to the permanent ones, we see the temporary ones that hover around this one here. And just for reference, this is our nearest hospital, it's the Temecula Valley Hospital. It is the next exit immediately passing this checkpoint. And in considering the pandemic that we're in, I mean, this is very critical here. The temporary checkpoints that pop up will occur in this area of Pala, will happen on the 76, which is basically an east and west route. And then in this area of the Luz right here. This area in particular is very concerning because this is part of Fallbrook. It's a agricultural community here. As a matter of fact, I'll show you what the satellite picture looks like. I mean, this is agriculture. Just right here in hills and whatnot. But for the most part, these are agricultural communities. For the Luz, folks will have to come into Fallbrook to go to school, to go to the clinics, or they'll have to go to Temecula Hospital for any emergency care. Otherwise, the nearest hospital is twice as far. And we know that in emergency situations, that's critical. So during the stay-at-home orders that began on March 13th, a week later, we saw this checkpoint, the major checkpoint on the freeway, activated on a daily basis. The week following, we saw the smaller checkpoints also activate on a daily basis. Again, as soon as the stay-at-home orders began, we saw this increase in Border Patrol presence. This had an effect on local families, again, specifically in the Luz, who were depending on coming into Fallbrook to their schools so they could pick up food, lunch, had to pick up homework. We heard reports of people who just did not leave. They stayed on the ranches where they worked. And I should add that that's the typical life, even without this this increase here. Folks that just don't need to go somewhere. They stay on the ranches. They stay in the groves. As much as possible, they don't leave where they live, and where they live is usually where they work. So it's almost a plantation style containment here. And so that was very alarming to see that, folks were being impeded from receiving their basic necessities. And that was some of the situation we were dealing with there. This is some of a checkpoint heading to Pala on the east, going east and west. Again, stopping traffic. This is an agent here who stopped someone, removed his mask to talk to someone here. And just additional images here. I did mention that the police DUI checkpoints we saw them increase immediately after the attempt to pass HR 4437 as part of the attrition through enforcement strategy. We know that the Center for Immigration Studies is a part of a white nationalist policy network. Their intent was to make life as difficult as possible for undocumented communities, so they would self-deport. At the time, cities like Escondido were passing harsh anti-immigrant policies, followed by police UI license checkpoints. Operation Joint Effort was enacted within a few years during this time, which was a 287G style collaborative agreement between ICE and local police. So again, these police checkpoints were effectively immigration checkpoints. And with the fact that residents weren't eligible to attain a driver's license, that was part of the strategy there. And for every one drunk driver apprehended, 10 undocumented persons were apprehended and deported. Part of our response has been not only to alert the community and get folks on the ground to know what this presence looks like, but we also educate the community on how to report what they see, right? Because I mean, the terror is real. I mean, the terror is real. If just there's rumors of immigration raids, I mean, just with the rumor, it can spread, and it paralyzes our communities when we're being misinformed. So we've taken steps to educate folks on how to document it, make sure the information that you're receiving is trusted, and how to adequately identify the agencies that are in your community. And as mentioned, building off of this network, we were able to respond to a rumored raid that was going to happen early within the Trump administration with community patrols. We were able to, since we knew the pattern of that ICE worked with in the mornings, we went out in 6 communities and were able to verify for ourselves with our own eyes if this was happening or not. And again, just a testament to the conditions that our communities are facing, and what we're the work that's happening to maneuver and protect our communities. Again, mix of ICE. This was one of the raids that we saw happening on Trump's visit to San Diego. Again, we constantly see the politicization, the weaponization of ICE, by this administration being used for political ends. And as we're seeing now, in some cases, law enforcement in California is supposed to not be working with Border Patrol, but it still continues to happen. This is something we documented about a year ago here in the area as well. So we know that the sheriffs in Temecula have openly said that we're going to oppose the state laws that prohibit immigration agencies from collaborating with local law enforcement. And so some of the activity that you can see on our Facebook page right now, you can find us on facebook.com/Alianza760. We've been posting checkpoints for the last week, these Border Patrol checkpoints that have been activated once again. And you can see some of the comments and concerns that people have there. I think it's important I think I'll close just with saying that there's a clear division, a clear concern for our community, just with the increase, just the fact that this network has increased so much in terms of the growth and the followers that are following. Recently, the city of Escondido had to decide, they voted on whether or not to accept funding to continue checkpoints. The city manager claimed that there was no opposition, that there was no concern, but that's just another statement that testifies to, how out of touch the local leadership is with our communities. This is definitely something of concern, and we've learned to organize to the best of our ability to confront it. And finally, I would say that I think it's important to recognize that checkpoints violate our human rights. Article 13 of the Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within borders of each state. I think it's important to recognize and amplify and denounce these checkpoints as a violation of our human rights. So we can continue to push for the end of these activities in our communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ricardo. And a lot of great information there in terms of how not only how the state apparatus impacts freedom of movement within a county that is along the border, but also how the communities resist. And Alianza Comunitaria is a testament of that resistance. So thank you for sharing that information. And I believe there's a question there in the chat that you could check out about social media expansion. Our next speaker is Estefania Castañeda Perez, and I'll read her bio. Estefania is a doctoral candidate at the UCLA Department of Political Science, trained as an interdisciplinary scholar. Her research primarily focuses on the conceptualization and consequences of violence and border politics. Her dissertation examines the injurious effects of state violence at the Mexico-US border on the lives of transborder commuters. Estefania has a master's degree in political science from UCLA and a bachelor's degree in political science with an honors minor in interdisciplinary studies from San Diego State University. As a transborder student raised in Tijuana, she splits her time between Tijuana and Los Angeles in a borderless pursuit of education. Currently, she serves as the Chief Development Editor at the Chicanx Latinx Law Review at the UCLA School of Law and participates in various public education initiatives, including Transborder Justice, aimed at supporting transborder youth and asylum seekers in the Mexico-US borderlands. And I can certainly say that Estefania has done extensive research at the ports of entry, both here in San Diego, Tijuana, and El Paso, Ciudad Juarez. So it's a really interesting kind of information that Estefania is able to bring in with her study. So thank you, Estefania. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Pedro. I'm going to share my screen so I can show my PowerPoint. Give me a second here. I think it's this one. Okay. All right. Perfect. So thank you so much again, Pedro, as well as the Tribune del Pueblo for hosting us. It's truly a privilege to be able to present in this space. And, my name is Estefania, and I'm a transborder student from Tijuana and a PhD candidate in the Political Science Department at UCLA, and again, the curator for Transborder Justice. And transborder commuters are individuals that reside typically on one side of the border, but regularly cross the border into the adjacent country. And my dissertation looks at individuals that cross from the Mexican side of the border into the US for various purposes, including work, education, commerce, family visits, among other reasons. And as part of this doctoral dissertation, I'm examining the impacts of state, legal, and gender violence at the border and across various contexts and spaces in Mexico and in the US on the lives of transborder commuters from Tijuana, Nogales, and Ciudad Juarez. And I have been conducting research on transborder commuters since 2013. And back then, my focus of my research was on how post 9/11 border militarization impacted border crossing experiences. Specifically, 9/11 in particular was a key political moment for expanding the powers of the state and its law enforcement agencies at the detriment of civil rights and liberties, particularly in the areas that are typically considered legal gray zones. Before 9/11, people would wait about 15 minutes or 30 minutes at most in order to cross the border. Post 9/11, border traffic lasted for more than 4 hours on a regular. And since then, border traffic has forced many transborder commuters, especially workers and students, to live by the clock. Time is an obsession to the point where many transborder commuters experience insomnia the night before the day they have to cross. Here's a testimony for Andrea, which is a pseudonym, of a young woman who I interviewed for my dissertation research. She says, on Mondays, I would wake up at midnight. I would sleep around 9 or 10 p.m. and wake up at midnight because Mondays are the worst days to cross. After we crossed, my mom and I would sleep in our car at a parking lot near a shopping center. At 6 a.m., we would wake up, put on makeup, and get ready before my mom dropped me off at my high school at 7 a.m. I was always the first and the last to arrive and leave school. This testimony from Andrea mirrors other testimonies from similarly affected transborder youth, the vast majority who are actually US citizens, who discuss that the primary reason they engage in this type of mobility is to have access to opportunities their parents never had, such as learning English or going to school in the United States. But what keeps them going is the desire and aspiration of one day attaining stability. Now, let me go back to that. Okay. Now, for many, crossing the border is one of the most traumatic, stressful life experiences. Waiting in line to cross can feel like a lifetime. Many have reported that they feel anxiety, stress, nausea, headaches, and many other health-related outcomes. These mental health consequences become more severe when there are drastic changes at the border, especially as a result of heightened paramilitary style enforcement. In 2018, CEP officers shut down the border for a few minutes on several occasions, sometimes unannounced, appeared in riot gear, placed barbed wire and barricades at ports, basically making it look even more like a war zone. It already was a war zone, but these events further increased that. And this was a response largely in preparation of the arrival of migrant caravans, but obscured from this spectacle of violence was the inconvenient truth behind the US-generated crisis, stemming largely from illegal metering policies or pushback practices, which place an artificial restriction on a number of asylum seekers, the amount of asylum seekers that are allowed to cross the US in order to begin the process of seeking asylum. These operations, which are carried out in the open for the public to witness, have also evoked emotional and psychological reactions from transborder commuters, particularly as many feel heightened paranoia and anxiety about the possible escalation of violence against their own communities. Since March, the US has restricted its borders for essential travel, only allowing US citizens and lawful permanent residents to cross the border during the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, CBP has arbitrarily and ambiguously defined who is an essential traveler in order to discriminate against visa holders who also depend on being able to cross the border for their livelihoods. Every month, there are new announcements about border closures. And in my research, I have identified many families who experience psychological distress every month that there's a new restriction, and many haven't even been able to see their families since March. Many now find themselves in a mobility limbo. In May, CBP shut down the Otay port of entry for several hours at night, roughly from 11 p.m. until 6 a.m., forcing many to sleep overnight in their cars while they waited to cross. On August 21st, CBP reduced personnel at select ports of entry, closed off lanes, and deliberately slowed down traffic at ports of entry in order to discourage people from crossing. These measures were implemented in the weekend of August 21st, causing unprecedented chaos at the border and in Mexican border cities. Many families returning home or going to work in the US were forced to wait in the 90-degree weather for approximately 11 hours. Border traffic was so extreme that on August 23rd, an 87-year-old woman died while she waited in the car with her family to cross the San Isidro border. These long waits were an act of cruelty meant to cause as much suffering and to disrupt the lives of many who have depended on crossing the border for generations. And Pedro Rios described this event that took place over the weekend as collective punishment, a war crime under the Geneva Conventions, particularly to punish over 90,000 individuals that cross on any given day at the San Isidro port of entry. And although COVID is a global catastrophe affecting the most vulnerable communities, the US government has used it as an excuse and as a political tool to pass additional draconian immigration policies to make the Trump administration's obsession of sealing the border a reality. The events I have described are not the exception, they're actually the norm. This is what everyday life at the border looks like. With every new administration, there are always new changes at the border that decrease accountability of CBP for massive human rights violations and to increase impunity of CBP's actions. At ports of entry, CBP officers exert the use of force at their own discretion in order to engage in acts of verbal, physical humiliation, and intimidation. In the entire border infrastructure, for example, the barricades, the concertina wire, or the presence of armed CBP officers with canines are meant to instill fear and paranoia as a natural part of transborder life, and further criminalize all forms of cross-border mobility. And through their day-to-day interactions and operations, CBP represents not only the gatekeepers of the nation state, but also enforce racial, class, and gender divisions. Through my own experiential knowledge and through the testimonies I have gathered through my interviews, I have identified the systemic and systematic nature of racial profiling, racism, xenophobia, sexual assault, and other forms of gender violence perpetuated by CBP officers. Many I have interviewed describe their interactions with CBP as if they're engaging in a cross-examination with the prosecutor, some even being so nervous that they sometimes forget their personal information, for example, their birthday. But it would be a mistake to state that the CBP is simply doing its job, especially when the questioning and apprehensions are meant to be excessive and often have nothing to do with determining crossing legitimacy and more about intimidating and humiliating transborder commuters. Many individuals that cross, including US citizens, either do not fully know which are their rights at the border or do not know the agencies where they can file these reports to. For the most part, individuals do not file complaints because they fear repercussions, even if the complaint is submitted anonymously. In a survey I conducted in El Paso, and you can see here the results, I identified some of the most common rights violations that occurred. And out of 231 individuals that I've identified some type of right violation that had occurred, only 9 filed an actual complaint. Some repercussions I have identified through my own work include being sent to secondary inspection continuously, harassment from CBP officers, threat of taking away their visas or those of their family members. What this environment generates is the relationship that commuters have with the state, especially within the border context, is one of utter and complete subordination. The events of 9/11 and the borders and the subsequent policy changes that have pushed policymakers across the political spectrum are meant to, first and foremost, brutalize and terrorize immigrant and transborder communities in the US and worldwide through surveillance, biometric technology, and the never-ending presence of the military. What is happening at the border is not unique to the ports of entry. It is a reflection of the amplification of the state controls over the lives of racialized and marginalized communities. And CBP's actions have been bolstered by the willful cooperation of Mexican immigration agencies. This normalization of state violence and the presence of the border contributes to the erasure of indigenous struggle and communities, especially of the fact that in occupied territory and in stolen land, there are no borders. The purpose of the border was never to simply be a physical structure like the border wall. It was meant to expand and permeate into society through interior checkpoints, become externalized through third safe country agreements and government collaborations, and embodied by individuals, institutions through constant policing and interrogation of marginalized communities. In the tradition of imperialist expansion, the border and the carceral state are perpetual. So I wanted to end just with concluding thoughts of what is to be done. And this is a very complicated question, but similarly as Alma has indicated, thinking about reforms is sort of putting a Band-Aid over issues that are inherently systemic. So first and foremost, as individuals across the United States and worldwide are engaging in the debate of police abolition, of defunding the police, when I hear these debates about the abolition of the carceral state, I think it's extremely connected to the border. So first and foremost, it's about organizing ourselves and finding a way to make these demands that community members have been trying to make, to the defunding of CBP and the abolition of related agencies, including ICE, Border Patrol, and DHS. Furthermore, and this is more of what I have found in my own work, while engaging in these efforts, it is very important to have visible know your rights signs inside inspection facilities at ports of entry, including the Declaration of Human Rights and any civil liberties, both in Spanish and in English, that apply within ports. And we need to have the names of the supervisors on duty fully visible, as well as the number of government agencies and non-governmental agencies where individuals can file rights complaints. We also need to be working with grassroots organizations and community-led organizations that have been doing this work for generations and for years, and really listen to people on the ground. If you have a platform, ensure that you're giving space for those that have been doing this work for many years. And finally, we need to engage in transborder and transnational solidarity, because what's happening at the border is not unique to the US-Mexico border. There's other transborder regions around the world and especially other occupied territories, right? So if we think about Israel and Palestine, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Guatemala and Mexico, just to name a few examples, also experience similar struggles of self-determination and against state and border violence. So it's important to think about what's happening at the border as part of this global struggle against state violence. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for the space.
Pedro, I think you're muted.
Thanks. I was thanking you, Estefania, for your illuminating presentation and how the connections, you begin to see patterns from your presentation to Ricardo's presentation to Alma's presentation in terms of how the state responds with violence in order to address issues of control in some way. And so really appreciate your perspective. Our next speaker is Vanessa Ceseña, who's a colleague of mine, works with me here at the U.S.-Mexico Border Program in San Diego, and I'll read her bio. Vanessa is a Human Rights Program Associate for AFSC's U.S.-Mexico Border Program, where she focuses on documenting human and civil rights violations in the border region. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles, and her master's degree in social work from the University of Southern California. Her focus has been on immigration issues affecting vulnerable populations in the border region. In her previous role as Director of Immigrant Services at Catholic Charities, she expanded access to legal services and support for families in deportation proceedings. She has also worked as a clinician with unaccompanied minors, as well as with adults experiencing mental health issues while in immigration detention. She grew up on the U.S.-Mexico border in San Diego. Thank you, Vanessa, for joining us and for sharing your presentation today.
Great, thank you. I do have a presentation to share, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully, let me see. You guys can see my very messy desktop there. Hold on. I think this was happening earlier. Give me 1 second, sorry. In preparing all of this, I think my computer got a little heated up. Give me 1 second. There we go. Fingers crossed. There we go. Tech difficulties, right? This entire pandemic sometimes. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so thank you again for the invitation. It's always helpful for me, I think, to be able to participate in these spaces and be able to continue learning from colleagues and from people that I've known and that I have worked alongside for many, many years. So I do appreciate all the previous presentations. And as Pedro mentioned, I am the Human Rights Program Associate at AFSC's U.S.-Mexico Border Program. And for those of you that aren't maybe familiar with AFSC, we are a nonprofit organization that has been advocating for peace and justice for a little over 100 years. And our U.S.-Mexico Border Program has been focusing on documenting civil and human rights violations in the border region in San Diego since the 70s. And our program in San Diego specifically focuses on policy impact and advocacy at the local and state and national levels on base and alliance building, and as well as documentation, which is the focus of my work. And when we refer to documentation, we also refer to some of the documentation situations, right, or instances that Ricardo and that Estefania shared. So alongside them, we have been equally documenting all of the changes in our border region that have occurred in the last handful of years under the current administration. But today I am going to focus specifically on discussing hopefully more in-depth or kind of like a reframing of how we look at ICE detention, and specifically how it really is an extension of border enforcement, and how oftentimes when we think about border enforcement, for those of us that don't live in this reality from day to day, we oftentimes forget to also mention and to include ICE enforcement, because it tends to look a little bit different. So here on the screen, actually, I wanted to visually show why sometimes tracking ICE enforcement or whatnot can be a little bit confusing, especially specifically in San Diego, because here we have so many different agencies that that are working alongside one another to conduct border enforcement, right? So the enforcement is very interwoven. There's an immense level of interagency collaboration between ICE, which is Immigration Customs Enforcement, CBP, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which includes Border Patrol, but also with other federal law enforcement agencies, which might not be as familiar. So the picture on the right-hand side, you all can see that the badges say police DHS, right? So Homeland Security also has their version of police. And they're the ones that we do see oftentimes working alongside CBP at the ports of entry. And they're the ones pictured on the left-hand side. And oftentimes it's very difficult, right? It's confusing to try to differentiate who is doing what. And ICE obviously falls within this context, and they work closely alongside. And ICE does have a presence at ports of entry, and they're also part of that initial processing of migrants and whatnot. So I wanted to just kind of break it down a little bit more in terms of where does ICE plug in terms of how migrants that are arriving at the ports of entry, like that their initial processing, right? So I just using a very, very basic example. Here on the left, we see in this picture, actually, Pedro Rios was able to capture. We see a family that had recently crossed and was being detained by Border Patrol. And I just kind of did a very basic flow chart. So that would constitute a Border Patrol apprehension in between the ports of entry. And then at one point, once Border Patrol is finished with their processing, which includes them taking pictures, them asking questions, fingerprinting folks, etc., right? They then at one point might determine that they are not going to deport the person at that moment, and they will transfer the custody over to ICE. And in that point, ICE then plays a major role in kind of what happens after, right, in that person or in that family's case. So then ICE, once they obtain custody, they then do their additional questioning and gathering of biometrics, whatever that means for them at that point. And then they make the determination as to whether they are going to release families or individuals into communities here in the US so they can reunify with family members or whoever it is, or they might decide to deport them and repatriate them back to their country, or they might decide that they cannot do either of those, and then they'll detain them and send them to ICE immigration prisons or detention centers as they refer to them. So that's more or less kind of what happens. So in between that entire process, right, it can look very different depending on each migrant situation. Some people are go through this process within a matter of days, and for some, all of this might take a few weeks, right? So during that time, they're in detention, they're in the hieleras, as they're constantly referred to, and a lot of really horrific stuff happens during that time. But so again, because I'm focusing my presentation on looking at ICE, I wanted to kind of dive a little bit further into what happens during ICE custody. And there's a lot more to go into it, but just wanted to focus more on highlighting and uplifting the voices of migrants. So this week, actually, AFSC alongside with Pueblos Sin Fronteras and Detention Resistance released a report, and the title is Compounding Suffering During a Pandemic, a case study in ICE's detention failures. And through that, we spent a few months, talking to migrants, listening to audio recordings from, previous encounters or whatnot, reading letters that folks had been sending, and we really we went through all of those testimonies to really try to paint the clearest picture and to clearly paint how egregious the violations are in detention. And when we're talking about ICE detention, right, we're not talking about just the detention center in San Diego. I'm using that as a as a quote unquote case study right now. But in reality, in fiscal year 2019, according to ICE's numbers or ICE's statistics, there were 48,850 migrants detained on average per month across 200 immigrant prisons, right? So then that gets broken down to an average length of stay of 36.2 days. But then at San Diego, we saw that the average length of stay was actually 87 days. And I pulled out some of the testimonies from the report, and I wanted to share those with you guys because this is what detention means. This is what ICE is doing, right, to our communities. So I think if we really focus on really asking directly impacted folks to share with us how they are viewing the changes of policies, how they are viewing enforcement tactics and all of that, then we were able to, view federal policies or elections, whatever it is, right, from a different lens. So here I wanted to highlight, this specific testimony where it says, this was from a woman, and she was talking about how, it is downgrading. She says, very downgrading as a human being, being locked in prison. It breaks my heart to go through this situation, especially being taken away from my home and separated from my family. And then she ends that with saying, I can't wait for this nightmare to end, and I don't know if my life will ever be the same. So all of these situations, right, of whether it's a border patrol apprehension, ICE apprehension, whatever it is, this is the type of impact that each one of those encounters has. And it could, we have talked to people that have that are frequent border crossers, and they also have, when you ask them, right, how did that situation make you feel? They're having similar feelings, about how customs officers treat them. So if we go back and think about the stats that Stefania showed and presented with us, I'm sure that during her process, she was also getting these types of testimonies, right, from border crossers in her case. And here's a few other ones. One migrant said, we don't have the care we need. We don't have masks. They're asking us to pay for making our own masks. In that case, specifically, the officers were threatening to charge them with destruction of federal property, the federal property being the uniform that they were wearing. So in the beginning of COVID, migrants were not being given masks, and therefore they had to kind of make their own. So that's why we included that testimony. And then somebody else said that they were constantly being humiliated by the nurses at the detention center. And those are nurses hired specifically by CoreCivic, for being undocumented in their case. I'm going to skip that one. I will come back at that. But we actually can, it's part of our work also focuses on documenting, worksite raids and everything else that ICE does apart from detention. And here I wanted to present a situation or an example of how ICE enforcement, and this specifically was Homeland Security investigations, which is a part of ICE, how their enforcement tactics look very similar to US military and other military style tactics, right? So here, last year, I should say, there was a worksite raid that ICE carried out where they targeted the Zion Market, which is in the Convoy area of San Diego, predominantly a Asian community, and this specifically was a Korean market. And during this worksite raid, which occurred in the morning, right when the market was opening, there were a total of 26 workers that were detained there at the market. And then prior to actually ICE officers showing up at the market, they had already arrested 3 workers. They arrested those 3 workers at their home, and they were targeted because they had worked at the market for a longer time. So they were targeted and they weren't working that day, and ICE HSI went to find them at their home, and they were detained at 6 in the morning. And in interviewing the workers, we saw that, or we learned that ICE, was only questioning workers that were associated with the market. If you were to walk into this market, you would see that there's a food court, there's other businesses, but as ICE entered, and you can see them here pictured on the screen, this was the main entrance to the market. They kind of blocked the entrances, but then they also, just focused their enforcement that day on the market part of Zion. So it was like a very clear indication that this operation was a quote unquote targeted operation. And when they carried out the raid, some of the officers did pull out their guns. Either they ran in with guns, or as they were apprehending workers that were inside, they were pulling out the guns. Some of the workers, including some of the female workers, were thrown down onto the ground. We heard that ICE, as they were getting everybody together, they handcuffed everybody using zip ties in the beginning, and were putting their hands in their pockets to take out their wallets and to find any what's called like identifying information, so their matricula consular or whatever it is that they had on them. And here are just a few pictures that I wanted to show about how it is that worksite raids are carried out. And we can see that a lot of the vests that they have, which they are bulletproof vests, say police, HSI. If this was an operation led by ICE ERO, which is removal operations, enforcement removal operations, their vests would say police ICE, which again is very misleading for community members. Here's another picture of how ICE agents were blocking off, the different entrances and the different corridors in this specific market. Here's another one. They kind of entered from all directions. So in the loading dock, they have that. And what was more, I would say for me personally, what was the most shocking from this raid was the way in which they arrested the workers that were at home. And how specifically they were treated. And one of them in particular, when he was arrested, he was actually on his way to take his daughter to school, and officers in civilian clothes approached their cars with their guns drawn out. And our office, as we were able to talk to the family members after, they shared that it was, extremely traumatizing for all of them, but especially to their teenage daughter that was physically in the car with her father. And she thought in the moment that the ICE officers came to the car, she thought that they were being abducted. She wasn't, somehow in the interaction, and this goes to show how ICE is, how they always fail at properly identifying themselves when they're out in community doing enforcement operations. But because they hadn't properly identified themselves, and because they weren't wearing uniforms, she thought that her and her dad were being abducted. And we later found out that this young adult, did have some, she was completely traumatized after, and she did have to go seek some additional supportive, counseling support services. And unfortunately, this testimony, or their testimony, and the testimonies of all of the workers that were impacted at the Zion market raid, and also from the testimonies from folks that are detained in ICE detention, is unfortunately very consistent across the board. A lot of this is not anything new, right, that we've heard. It's just, it tends to look a little bit different because the setting or the situation might be a little different. And we are preparing, AFSC is preparing to release a more comprehensive report on ICE enforcement. We will be releasing that within the next few weeks, and within that report we will be including a lot more individualized testimonies from workers that were arrested during the Zion market raid, but then also from other community members that have been, stopped in all of the different ways that Ricardo and Estefania you know, shared. And I really did want to actually end with the quote that I skipped earlier on. And this quote, it really stood out to me. This is again from somebody who is detained. And I'll read it out because the letter's a little bit, the font's a bit small, but it says, "They really don't care here at this facility about people. They really don't see us as human beings, I believe. I believe they just see us as a way that this facility, since it's privately owned, makes money off of us while being detained. What has to happen? How many people have to die after him," meaning Senor Carlos, who passed away, unfortunately, at the Otay Mesa Detention Center. Like, when will they start doing something to correct the situation here? How many more people have to get sick? And how many more people have to end up dying before they actually do something and correct the mistake? You know, so that's a very powerful statement, right? And it really goes to show, I mean, again, recalca everything that we have been saying and that a lot of our organizations and advocates have been saying for many, many years, that, you know, there has to be accountability. There has been a lack of accountability. You know, there's been numerous people that have died, unfortunately, at the hands of ICE and Border Patrol agents and customs officers. And this is really, you know, all forms of enforcement, but especially, I think, enforcement that takes place in our border regions. You know, it's psychological warfare, right? The goal is to make sure that people are impacted in ways that will deeply, you know, change them and impact them for the future. So I will end there. I thank everybody again for the space, and hopefully we can continue the conversation during the question and answer period.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you so much for sharing with us the testimonies of migrants, especially those that had the opportunity to tell their stories through the report. I did provide a link to the report in the chat so that folks can access it. Our next speaker is Vicky Galbeca. Vicky currently serves as director for the Southern Border Communities Coalition, a program of Alliance San Diego that brings together organizations from San Diego to Brownsville to ensure that border enforcement policies and practices are accountable and fair, respect human dignity and human rights, and prevent the loss of life in the region. Prior to this role, Vicky served as director of the ASOU New Mexico's Regional Center for Border Rights, based in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where she helped develop and implement its mission of addressing civil and human rights violations that stem from border-specific immigration policy. Vicky was born in Mexico City, and she has lived in various border communities, including Monterrey, Las Cruces, Nogales, and Tucson. Vicky, thank you for joining us today. Vicky will be sharing with us, you know, we're hearing all this terrible stuff. Who's accountable, right? So Vicky will share a little bit about the question of where the money comes from.
Oh, thank you so much, Pedro. And currently I do live in Tucson, Arizona. And thank you for inviting me to talk in this space. And I also want to thank el Tribuno del Pueblo for inviting me to this space. I'm going to share my screen right now, and we're going to be maybe changing gears a little. But so basically what I would like to, I guess one of the things that I wanted to talk or share with the group is how, you know, where does this all start? Can everybody see this? Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Again. So basically, you know, we've talked a lot about state-sponsored violence and the militarization of the border, and thank you for my colleagues for talking about the history of border militarization and how ICE and CBP have played a role in it. But all of these activities need to be funded somehow. They're not volunteers. Border Patrol agents and ICE agents do not volunteer to do their job. They actually get paid to do it, and they get paid thanks to your taxpayer dollars. So I think, how do I advance? Oh, I see the button now. So, Pedro already talked about this a little bit, about SBCC, which we were formed in 2011, and who we are, and all the groups from San Diego to Brownsville, and what our main mission is. But I also wanted to flag that we recently developed a new border vision that advocates for a new border governance model based on a lot of international human rights conversations around how do we better define what happens at the border. And this model will actually ensure and expand community safety for all. It aims to protect human rights and human life, and it would create a welcoming system for border residents and newcomers. So that's ultimately our goal. How do we rethink border so that this violence and racially motivated policies can be eliminated, and how Border Patrol agents and any kind of law enforcement agent can be held accountable. So let's just start with like the real quick basic, how does a federal budget get formed? I think that this is basically offers a quick outline, would offer where the windows are of opportunity where we can, affect some kind of policy change around these federal budgets. So the very first thing that happens is the agencies like, Homeland Security or Health and Human Services or Department of Justice, they sort of develop their own proposal for their budgets and they submit it to the White House. And then typically what happens is the president looks at this budget and kind of makes his own additions or edits or whatever, and then submits it, usually around the first Monday of February. And the reason I say usually is because, or typically, is because during an election year, that comes a little bit later sometimes, like towards the end of February. So when the new administration is sworn in, it takes a little bit longer for that budget to get sent over to Congress. And then there's like this process that each chamber follows through, which is called the 302A allocation. It's basically the caps that they're going to allow for the budgeting process. And then that gets sent back to the Appropriations Committee, and then the Appropriations Committees create their own caps, which are called the 302B allocations. And as you can see here on the right-hand side, there are 12 subcommittees that make up the appropriations process on both sides. So there's a defense subcommittee in the House, and there's a defense subcommittee in the Senate. And they then start playing around with the numbers and try to come out with their own version of what their budget should look like. Then, the bill, so the very first thing that happens with the bill after it gets introduced by the subcommittee, sometimes it's introduced and it gets all marked up. People, a lot of either the senators or the congressional members, try to include amendments, but whether or not amendments to that proposal can happen is all depending on what the chair decides. The approved bills that pass out of subcommittee then go to the full Appropriations Committee for another markup if the chair allows another markup. And then the bills that pass the full Appropriations Committee get introduced to the floor of each chamber, and all at a different timeline, by the way. This doesn't happen at the same time for a floor vote. And so, for example, we saw in the House side for the fiscal year 21 budget, we saw probably one of the most progressive appropriations, DHS, Homeland Security appropriations bill, pass out of committee, but then it just got stopped there. It didn't go further. It didn't go to the floor for a vote. And it was a subject of a lot of controversy, and we were a little bit disappointed by that. But that conversation will probably get picked up again in December. So then once both bills pass on the Senate side and the House side, then they go to a conference where then it becomes like a negotiation among the four corners, which are basically the leaders of the House and the Senate. Although what we've been seeing recently, another weird thing that's been happening is that the leader of the House has been negotiating with the OMB, the minutiae over what the bills are going to look like, particularly in these. Well, I'll talk about that later. And then that's where the conference is happening, which is very unusual. But then, of course, once it passed, then it goes well, another piece is that then then sometimes, so that we have 12 subcommittees, right? And so then they decide, well, should we try to send them to the floor as an omnibus? Or should we create like these mini omnibuses? Like, let's put the least controversial ones together and then send them to the floor. And then we'll continue negotiating on the more challenging ones. And that has actually happened quite often with the Homeland Security proposal, because there's a lot of people who are advocating for a lot of change for that particular funding bill. So that one usually winds up getting pulled out of the omnibus and gets negotiated later. So once everybody's agreed in conference, then the bill goes to the president for his signature. He signs it, that's it. The fiscal year budget has been decided. But if he vetoes it, that basically restarts the whole conference, and that veto requires, as we know, a 2/3 majority to override. Now, the deadline for congressional approval and the presidential signature is September 30th. If there is no consensus on that bill or group of bills, Congress passes a continuing resolution, which basically keeps the same funding level of the prior fiscal year for up to whatever time frame. It could be, a few hours, or it could be a few months. And if the president refuses to sign the continuing resolution, then the government is shut down, which we saw just a couple of years ago when the government was shut down probably for the longest time in history, when the president was fighting over border wall funding. But so then that's sort of basically what happens. But another thing that might happen in the continuing resolution process is that when people realize that, oh, we're never going to get to an agreement, we're going to have to pass a continuing resolution. Sometimes what the White House does is says, like, hey, I get that we're going to have to keep the funding levels at fiscal year 2020 levels, but my program is going to need an anomaly. It's going to need more money because X, Y, and Z has happened. And so I'm okay with you guys doing a continuing resolution, but I need that little bit more money. And that's exactly what the White House did this year when the conversation around continuing resolution came up, and they said, well, ICE and CBP need some more money if that's what you're going to do. And a lot of the advocates came together, and that didn't happen. I was proud to see that none of that money that the White House requested for the continuing resolution for CBP and ICE were included. Another thing that happens too, related to funding, is that legislative bills that are outside of appropriations will sometimes recommend amount to the committee in the bill. Like they say they want to buy, I'm just giving an example, we need 100 more cars at $100 each. They'll actually write that in the bill, like government should buy cars, And then when the appropriations committee comes up, they look at all the requests that are actually in past legislation, and they will consider adding that money in, or sometimes not put it in. And then the other type of funding that we've seen particularly recently is like emergency or supplemental funding around wars, natural disasters, and pandemics such as COVID-19. We've seen 3 or 4 COVID-related supplemental budgets passed. And then there's this last one that's just basically not going anywhere because the House and the Senate disagree on the amount that should be spent on that supplemental funding. So basically what SBCC has done is where our work is mostly focusing on the Homeland Security Subcommittee. We meet with staffers to advocate for community needs, and some of the friendly staffers will incorporate our input into appropriations. And sometimes they incorporate more than just the money, because we don't actually make recommendations on money, but we say something like cut this or don't fund that, but also put in there that you're not going to allow transfers of money. So for example, when Trump declared a national emergency and then transferred DOD funding, military funding, Pentagon funding that had already been appropriated by Congress, and he took that money and he said, I'm going to put this money towards border wall under this emergency declaration. We were able to advocate in the fiscal 21 House version of the appropriations, the prohibition of those types of transfers, because frankly, that was done unlawfully. Only Congress controls the power of the purse. So these policies also, these appropriations bills also sometimes include restrictions. So for example, they include like maybe, okay, I think 1 year Congress gave $1.375 billion for border wall construction, but put the prohibition of border wall construction near the Santa Wildlife Refuge and things like that. So those types of restrictions can also be included. We've also have been working with other appropriations committees, but I think, and I'll talk about this a little bit, but I think what happened is that many of these other committees also have money that somehow affects, you know, immigration and border communities, immigrants and border communities. So for example, the Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee that's where you will find the funding for the prosecutions that the Department of Justice does when Border Patrol takes a person that they've apprehended and then they refer them to the Department of Justice, to U.S. Marshals, for them to be prosecuted under improper authority, improper entry and improper re-entry. Now, I want to flag, for people who are not familiar with these 1325, 1326 prosecutions, commonly known as Operation Streamline, these were actually established, these statutes were actually passed in 1929, the same year that the Undesirable Alien Act was passed. And it was actually pushed by a Democrat who was a senator. His name was Coleman Livingston Blease, and he was a renowned white supremacist. And so these statutes have been on the books for more than 100 years, but have been used, you know, off and on over the years to prosecute individuals who are apprehended between ports of entry. So, you know, we of course want these statutes to be defunded because of the implications of the origins of these statutes, along with the fact that these cause undue hardships on families. It was the reason why the zero tolerance policy under Sessions was implemented, where families were torn apart. So we really want to eliminate those statutes from the books. We also have been looking at the defense budget, all those others that intersect with immigrants and border communities. And so this is a little bit more about our work with the, you know, other committees that we've worked with, but these are more specifically on legislation, pushing back against harmful policies. We provide questions for legislative hearings, and we provide written statements for legislative hearings. So basically, I mean, our asks are huge, and we've been working with a lot of committees about, you know, how do you get into the nitty gritty and really try to change how these programs that are imbued with racial profiling and racial injustice and violence against our communities, what is the mechanism that we can use in Congress to defund them? And so we've been looking at several different, you know, basic lines and how we can basically dismantle, you know, beginning with the subcommittee structure, right? Like there's 12 subcommittees. Why did they break them down the way they did? And why did they put, you know, some things here and some things there? And maybe there's a different way that those can be organized differently in order to really gain some transformative changes, not just in proposals like in immigration reform, but also in a transformative budget process, right? So, but I think that fundamentally our asks are, we need to figure out a way to defund DHS, CBP, in other words, no more agents, eliminate these checkpoints, ensure that Fourth Amendment protections extend to all border communities, including at ports of entry, defund the DOJ prosecutions that I mentioned earlier. Defund the 1033 program, which is basically when the military decides they have surplus equipment and they just give it away to local law enforcement and CBP. And some of those things include things like rifles and grenades and tear gas and rubber bullets and things like that just increase the violence against our communities. So how can we defund that program and make sure that they don't have access to that kind of equipment? Of course, no more money for border wall, but fundamentally we want to also, let's be transformative here. Let's take part of it down, including the concertina wire, and actually start focusing on repairing the harms that the construction of this border wall has created. We need to restore the refuge. We need to, like here in Arizona, the San Pedro River, which was the last free-flowing river, is now interrupted by a border wall, and we need to, tear that wall down and restore that river so that it continues to flow freely. How do we repair the damage that's caused to endangered wildlife? How do we ensure? And this is probably the most important question. How do we create more channels of entry at ports of entry? By investing in things like welcoming centers that are staffed by social workers and trauma specialists and pediatric specialists and have these as places where people can come through our ports of entry in a way that's efficient and protects their dignity and their human rights, to make sure that then they can be. And that the work of Border Patrol and the Office of Field Operations officials is very limited to the, oh, hello, this is who you are, this is where you go. It's just a referral process. And they have nothing else to do with processing an asylum claim or how can we help these people who are coming to our country seeking protections. And another thing, we have this idea of abolishing ICE. I just wanted to flag that, I don't know why people are so surprised when they hear this abolish ICE and think that's a crazy radical thing to suggest, because it's not. If you read the 2003 Homeland Security Act, there is a section there that says, I'm not kidding, it says abolish INS, which means Immigration and Naturalization Services. Now, the Homeland Security Act of 2003 was basically a result of 9/11, where the government decided on very quick and short order to just take all of these agencies and throw them together. And they created this huge monster called the Department of Homeland Security. Before that act, the customs agents were actually a separate agency under the Treasury Department. And I think now it behooves us to somehow look at a more transformative act that would start taking those pieces apart. And now OFO falls under an agency that might be friendlier to, what they originally started being, which was like check for, imports and see if there are any pests coming across of the fruit, that is. And then determine, in a humane way with dignity, how do we receive people who come to our borders? Also, how do we facilitate cross-border traffic for people who regularly live in border communities and visit their friends on both sides? Like I visit my family on both sides of the border. We go shopping down there and we come back over. And I just think that's how we can rethink how borders work and that border governance model. And then finally, how do we take all that money that we've spent on law enforcement only, building walls and all this excessive violent uses of our money, because it is our money fundamentally, and instead spend it in healthcare, education, mental health, and even in improvement of port infrastructures. And I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Vicki, for your presentation and in making the information around the appropriations process much more accessible for us. I'm sure there's a lot there that we can go back to and learn from and digest. And I included in the chat the webpage for the Southern Border Communities Coalition. There's a new resource page that has a lot of facts and figures about border wall, about money, that I invite you to visit, as well as the AFSC Abolish ICE page, which has also resources about what does Abolish ICE mean, how you can participate, and how you can lend your voice to that campaign as well. So we are over time, but I want to see if maybe we can spend just another 15 minutes or so and see if there are any questions that for any of our panelists or thoughts that folks might have. And I would definitely invite you to place your question in the chat. I think that would be the easiest way to figure out how to respond to these. So first question, it says much of the Border Patrol personnel today, particularly frontline operatives, are drawn from border communities. A large swath are Latinx. Using marginal groups to enforce imperially constructed borders has long been a tactic of settler colonialism. Today, these positions have an even stronger alert to working class Latinx folks due to the healthcare and benefits federal jobs have. Do any of the panelists have any suggestions on ways or tactics to prevent CBP from recruiting working class Latinx folks, both through resisting recruitment drives and providing sustainable alternatives? This would also help for those who have students expressing desires to work for the police and their recruitment drives in Black and brown communities. Would anyone like to take on that question?
This is Vicki. I mean, this would be one suggestion and something that we've had many conversations around in a lot of groups is how do we create different kinds of jobs? Because unfortunately, in border communities, that's where the jobs are a lot of times when people are looking. So how do we build like green jobs? How do we create more green jobs and infrastructure type jobs that move away from that law enforcement model that we've invested way too much money in? That would be just one suggestion.
Great, thank you, Vicki. And in the chat, I included a page from the War Resisters League that they have a really interesting document that you can hand out to youth about the problematic nature of being recruited by Border Patrol. Would anyone else like to comment, or should we move to another question?
No,
oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that it's very important to center resiliency and human rights on the visions and aspirations of our communities. When I look at the U.S.-Mexico border and when we meet with communities, I mean, there's big inequalities that happen in urban and rural areas, and I think that we need to start figuring out what a resilient community look like with the participation of those who are suffering these inequalities. And I think that the pandemic really has made us very aware that for many, many decades, we have been suffering tremendous gaps and inequalities of infrastructure, lack of hospitals, lack of sustainable jobs, no? And I think that one way to do it, one way to look at it will be really trying to get away from looking at the border as a space that the only thing that you can do is continue militarize it. And for that, we have to also look at the institutions that are continuing to reproduce this militarization. And we have to look at the role of not only immigration enforcement agencies or Congress, we also have to look at the universities and the type of knowledge that they're producing. The University of Texas at El Paso, for instance, it's a university that it's well funded by Lockheed and by Boeing. And it has the biggest number of, it's graduating a lot of Latinos and people of color, but are going towards those type of militaristic industries. And so is the University of Arizona. So I think that we need to start looking at it, and the institutions of knowledge must also have to align with a different vision.
Great, thank you, Alma. Ricardo, were you going to comment as well?
Sure, I wanted to add something. I mean, the short answer is organize, organize, organize. You know, I know that the new board revision has been passed at certain school districts, right? I believe Northern California, I think in Vista as well. I mean, that's a great way to begin the pushback in our school systems, right? Because that's often where the recruitment happens. You know, young brown folks, you know, graduating from high school. I know that I think you only need a high school degree to get to start working for the Border Patrol. So, you know, there's many different ways to push back, you know, against this. And, you know, I think school districts is a way to go about it. One way to.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. There's a question about any actions planned for Human Rights Day at the border in December. Vanessa, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I was just actually inputting it in the chat. But so in San Diego, where I'm starting to have the conversations with local partners to see what type of event or events or actions or whatnot make the most sense given everything that's happening. But we always share information on actions on our social media, so you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and we'll be sharing information on upcoming actions there. We might also do something in November, but we'll be, again, updating everybody that way.
Thank you, Vanessa. A specific question for Alma. Do you think this country, the US, was created under violence? Examples, Black slaves, indigenous people, and so on.
I mean, we continue to live those experiences and those inequalities, no? When we have farm working communities that are trapped in rural areas without having access to healthcare, without being able to go to the nearest hospital right now in the middle of a pandemic because of the immigration checkpoints, you know that those systems were intended to structure our lives like that. And at the same time, I believe that it is our responsibility as human rights organizers to start reflecting on not only what happened in the past, but also why that violence continues to happen and continues to be similar. We continue to experience similar violences and continue to experience the same laws, like Vicky mentioned, no, that have their origins on white supremacism. Some of the first founders of the Border Patrol were known white supremacists. Some of the greatest violence that has been inflicted upon Black and Brown communities have been done through the use of guns. Some of those people who were the first patrols of the U.S., Border Patrol, also went on to serve on the NRA, And so there are many systems and institutions that produce those systems of violence. And I think that, like my compañero said, that we really need to be able to organize. No human rights report really is going to be able to change the systems of inequalities. And the only thing that can change that is by organizing ourselves as communities and present a united front, and decir ya basta, no? We cannot endure more violence. I don't know what happens if a Trump administration wins, no? This would be truly, truly devastating for communities of color. So organizing is the key to prevent further and massive, irreparable harm to our communities and to our families.
Thank you, Alma. Any other questions from our guests today? When will we begin to think about turning away from the current two-party system that has created and perpetuates all of these injustices and create an independent political force of our own? That is to say, the power of human beings instead of political entities created by financial interests. So definitely a good question there. Would any of the panelists like to take it on? It's both a comment and a question, I believe.
I mean, I can make a quick comment about that. You know, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, especially as I think about like, when we say, you know, the abolition of borders, what do we actually mean by that? And that goes the same. It's very, you know, it's important to engage in solidarity with global communities. I think oftentimes we think of our policies having only impacts within the nation state, but these systems of oppression are not, they're borderless. You know, we're interconnected with so many different struggles worldwide. And usually we think about border issues as just being this unique space. And even within the border, right? Sometimes we tend to focus on regional parts of the border too. So if we want to envision a world beyond a two-party system, right? We have to think about like what are some, what do global communities look like, and what does like sort of I don't know how to say it in English, somebody can help me, but like movimiento autogestionado, or like you know, sort of
self-determination.
Right. And there have been already communities worldwide that have engaged in this, right? Like such as the Zapatista movement. So if we can look at those movements as examples, I think that we can envision something that we can engage in governance and rely on community members, right? Instead of thinking about safety and looking at law enforcement, we have to look at safety within our own communities and what that looks like. And when I think even about, okay, so moving beyond the two-party system, and if we want to create global communities, when we say the end of borders, we also mean the abolition of the nation state. As Dr. Angela Davis says, the state is increasingly becoming obsolete. So we have to think about what can we do in the meantime to organize and educate others about what global communities look like, and looking long-term, what does the stateless world look like?
Thank you, Estefania. Ricardo, were you also going to comment on that question? And maybe that might be Ricardo's comment might be the final one, and I'll pass it on to Laura to close it up after Ricardo's comment.
Sure, yeah, I appreciate that question. I think that's, our communities have been thinking outside of the two-party system. Movements have been happening, there's been a lot of resistance, and that's usually where the strongest resistance is found. Alianza Comunitaria is intentionally nonpartisan. We don't put our services, our network at the service of any candidate or any party, precisely because that reason. We know the Democratic Party enabled the current situation. And we hold both accountable for what we're facing. So we believe in building dual and contending power, organizing ourselves under our own interests. And oddly, that put us in a position where we were communicating to our community, where the local government failed to do so. In natural disasters, we found ourselves in a situation where we were effectively communicating to our community better than the local county government because of that that continued lack of government that we deserve. And also in local, I think local elections are very effective in terms of running outside of the two-party system. We're seeing that here in Fallbrook. We've been able to run a couple candidates here locally for our local boards without the help of the local Democratic Party. We've been able to be an effective force on our own. So within local communities, local politics, it's possible, and we're doing it, and we need to keep pushing that. Oftentimes we get boxed into this idea that even to participate in the political life of our communities, it has to be one party or the other. No, especially at a local level, it's possible to do so, and to even begin to take some of these spaces where we can further push a human rights agenda.
Great, thank you. Before I pass it on to Laura, I just want to thank all the panelists. I know you took an extra half hour to answer these questions. Your time is very precious, and I know you're very busy and committed to the work. So thank you so much for all of your outstanding work, presentations, commitment, and for your solidarity. Laura, closing comments, please. Thank you. You're muted, Laura.
Sorry. No, I also want to thank the panelists for their, contribution to these talks that we've been having around the human rights on both sides of the border. And this is our last one. The next step that we're going to have is we're going to have a press conference, and on October 29, which we're going to invite everyone and of course the media, so that we could make a report on our findings with of this zooming to the border trips that we've been taking since August. And so keep posted, because after these panels, we've been asked to do more panels on different issues, and we're discussing that. The recordings of these panels are gonna be uploaded in the People's Tribune and Tribuno del Pueblo. We're working on that right now, and it probably be within 2 or 3 days that we'll have all of that on the website. So thank you again, and just keep organizing and fighting, and human rights for everyone. It doesn't matter which color. And also, I love Leno's shirt because no human being is illegal. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.